Andrew has been something of a dark cloud hanging over the royal family for a number of years. The king has taken the right steps in terms of stripping him of every privilege, his title, the letters patent, which formally removed.
The gilded gates of Windsor have witnessed countless family dramas, but nothing quite prepared the world for what unfolded behind closed doors when Prince Andrew made his desperate plea to return to royal duties. While the public saw polite smiles, Princess Anne delivered a response so brutal it left courtiers speechless and Andrew visibly shaken. She didn't just disagree, she systematically dismantled his excuses and plans for a comeback. What did Anne actually say? And why are many calling it the most devastating moment in modern royal history? Join us as we uncover the full story about this savage response. Prince Andrew's fall, from grace and the desperate plea. Prince Andrew's reported plea for a royal comeback in 2025 did not happen out of nowhere, because it came after years of being slowly pushed out of the very institution he was born into. The Duke of York was once a working royal with military honors and regular public duties, and he moved through royal life with confidence and status. However, by October 2025, almost everything that once defined his royal identity had been taken away. When reports surfaced that he was allegedly begging for reinstatement, many people were shocked, yet those who had followed his long and public downfall understood why he had reached that point. The final blows came quickly and without softness, and King Charles made it clear that there was no road back to public royal life for his younger brother. What stood out most in Andrew's fall was how completely the monarchy took apart his royal standing. This was not just about stepping back from duties or quietly losing patronages, but it was about wiping away the public image of Prince Andrew altogether. The royal family wanted him to live as a private citizen, even though he was born into the House of Windsor. The events of October 2025 marked the peak of years of scandal and growing public anger, and Andrew's efforts to negotiate his way back into favor went nowhere. This was particularly true when it came to the one person who mattered most in these decisions.
8 or 10 of us, I think, at the dinner. If there was a party, then I'd know nothing about that.
Because King Charles had drawn a line in the sand, and his brother's pleas would not move it. Keep watching to find out exactly how the royal family stripped Andrew of everything he once held dear. The removal of Andrew's prince identity reached its breaking point in October 2025, when reports revealed that he was being required to use the surname Mountbatten Windsor in all official settings. This decision carried heavy meaning because it meant he would no longer be formally recognized as His Royal Highness Prince Andrew. Instead, he would appear simply as Andrew Mountbatten Windsor on official documents and correspondence, and on paper, this reduced him to the status of a common citizen. Sources close to the palace claimed that Andrew begged King Charles to let him keep the prince title for official use, but the king refused without hesitation. This change was not just about a name on paper, because it was about removing the last pieces of royal privilege that Andrew still held on to. Reports from the royal watchers suggested that this decision had been years in the making.
It is the maximization of my time for the best value for money.
And it followed Andrew's damaging connection to Jeffrey Epstein and the civil lawsuit filed against him by Virginia Giuffre. When the case was settled in 2022, Andrew's reputation had already taken a severe hit, yet the palace still allowed him to keep his titles in a technical sense. However, public pressure became impossible to ignore, and opinion polls showed that most people in Britain wanted Andrew completely cut off from the working monarchy. King Charles had always paid close attention to public opinion, just as his mother had before him, and he understood that small compromises were no longer enough. Back in January 2022, Queen Elizabeth II had already taken a decisive step when she officially stripped Andrew of his military roles and removed his Royal Highness status. That decision was meant to draw a clear boundary between the monarchy and the growing scandal, and at the time, it sent a strong message. Palace insiders said Andrew reacted with anger and disbelief then, because he felt his birthright was being taken away and believed the family was being unnecessarily harsh.
But in the 80s, in the early 80s, it was a new thing to do. So there was an element of surprise.
Even so, the late Queen did not change her position because she believed the monarchy could only survive by clearly separating itself from controversy. However, in October 2025, King Charles faced a different problem, because despite those earlier sanctions, Andrew was still quietly benefiting from royal identity and recognition in practice. By the time Charles moved to force Andrew to use Mountbatten Windsor exclusively, it became clear that this was not a symbolic warning but a final enforcement of what his mother had already set in motion. This decision could not be negotiated, and it closed the door on any remaining ambiguity about Andrew's status. Once again, insiders said Andrew reacted with anger and disbelief, believing that his brother was being deliberately cruel. Charles remained unmoved because he understood that half measures had failed before, and that the survival of the monarchy now depended on making those earlier decisions fully real and impossible to reverse. The world impact of this decision was immediate and serious.
And I've just wished to reiterate and to reaffirm,
because Andrew could no longer use royal status to gain access or command respect in social or business spaces. Invitations to elite events stopped almost overnight, and people who had stayed close to him out of respect for his royal position now had no reason to continue those relationships. The name change sent a clear message that Andrew was no longer protected by the crown. He was on his own, and the consequences of his past actions would follow him without any royal shield. This reality hit him hard, and it became one of the main reasons he began his desperate push to regain favor. Because without the title, he had lost the relevance he once relied on. However, the fight over Royal Lodge became the most visible and bitter chapter in Andrew's final fall from grace, and he had lived in the large 30-room mansion in Windsor Great Park since 2004. Queen Elizabeth II granted him a 75-year lease, and the property included wide grounds, outbuildings, and staff housing. It was a home designed for a senior royal.
But in order to have that passion and that belief, you need to have the idea.
And Andrew had grown deeply attached to it over the years. But by October 2025, King Charles made it clear that Andrew continuing to live in such a grand estate was no longer acceptable. Since the Crown Estate owns the property, pressure began building for Andrew to move out and relocate to a smaller home such as Frogmore Cottage. This was the same residence once used by Prince Harry and Meghan Markle before they moved to California. Andrew refused to leave, and this created a standoff that played out in the British press for months. He argued that his lease was valid, and he insisted that he had spent millions of his own money renovating the home. From his point of view, he had every legal right to stay, and he believed the family was trying to force him out unfairly. Reports from The Guardian suggested that King Charles grew increasingly frustrated with Andrew's refusal to budge, because Royal Lodge looked like an unnecessary luxury for someone who no longer carried out royal duties.
If you want to attract those talent, that is global talent, that's not just UK talent.
Charles reportedly wanted Andrew moved to a smaller property, or he considered opening Royal Lodge to the public as part of a plan to generate income for the Crown Estate. Many people agreed with this reasoning, because it seemed unreasonable for a disgraced former royal to live in a mansion while offering nothing in return. Public opinion strongly backed King Charles, and criticism of Andrew spread quickly across social media. Many people pointed out that ordinary families facing financial pressure would never be allowed to refuse downsizing. The situation made Andrew look entitled, and he was aware of it. Still, he refused to give in, because Royal Lodge was one of the last physical reminders of his former status. Losing it would mean admitting that his fall was final, and that was something he could not accept. Palace insiders claimed Andrew made several appeals to Charles, asking for a compromise that would let him stay. He even allegedly offered to take on minor royal duties in exchange for keeping the residence. Every proposal was rejected, because the king had already decided. Andrew's continued pleading only reinforced Charles's resolve. The Royal Lodge dispute became a clear symbol of Andrew's refusal to accept reality, and it showed how disconnected he was from public feeling. The issue of Andrew's rent added even more fuel to public anger, and when details of the lease became known, it was revealed that he was paying what many described as a peppercorn rent. Reports suggested the annual cost was shockingly low for a property of that size and prestige. Although exact figures were not officially released, sources said the amount was far below market value. This news came during a cost-of-living crisis, when many British families were struggling to afford housing. The idea that a disgraced royal was living in luxury for almost nothing was hard for the public to accept. This made it impossible for King Charles or other senior royals to support any return for Andrew, because even private sympathy would have been dangerous to show publicly. Andrew tried to justify the low rent by pointing to the money he had spent on renovations, but the argument did not land. Critics responded that he had lived there for decades, and any improvements mainly benefited him, not the Crown estate. The public mood had turned firmly against him, and his requests for understanding were met with ridicule. The rent controversy became another example of privilege without accountability, and it strengthened calls for Andrew to be fully cut off. However, the final financial blow came when King Charles officially stopped Andrew's annual allowance and ended payment for his private security. ITV News reported that Andrew had been receiving around £1 million each year to support his lifestyle and security. Losing this income changed everything almost immediately. The cost of maintaining Royal Lodge was high, and Andrew had no real source of income to cover it. His private security was expensive, but necessary due to threats and constant attention. Without family funding, he found himself scrambling for solutions, and he quickly realized he could not maintain his way of life alone. This pressure drove Andrew to make desperate appeals for reinstatement, and he reportedly asked other family members to speak to King Charles for him. He claimed the financial cut was cruel and left him exposed. Some reports even suggested he hinted at going public with private family matters if he was not helped. Whether these claims were real or exaggerated, the outcome did not change. King Charles did not give in, and the allowance remained cut. The message was clear, because Andrew was no longer entitled to royal support and had to face life on his own terms. The financial shutdown was meant to force him to accept his reduced status. Losing his title, his home, and his income created a perfect storm that left Andrew with very few options. Attempts to find private work failed because no respected organization wanted the association. His social circle collapsed, and even longtime friends kept their distance. The man who once served as a helicopter pilot in the Falklands War and lived as a senior royal was now largely isolated, and he was trying desperately to remain relevant. But here's the most intriguing part, so stay tuned. The crimes and controversies that blocked the door. Andrew's attempts to come back into royal life were doomed from the very beginning, and the reason had nothing to do with family politics or personal grudges alone, because the real barrier was his past itself. That past was filled with controversies so serious that no amount of begging could ever erase them from public memory. His relationships with convicted criminals, a catastrophic legal settlement, a disastrous attempt to defend himself in public, questionable business decisions, and growing political pressure all combined to make any return to the royal fold completely impossible. Even if his family had wanted to help, the scale of what he had done made it clear that keeping him close would destroy what the monarchy had been trying to rebuild. The central and most damaging controversy in Andrew's life was his long and troubling friendship with Jeffrey Epstein, and this connection alone was enough to disqualify him from ever representing the Crown again. Epstein was a convicted sex offender who preyed on minors, and yet Andrew continued to associate with him even after the conviction became public knowledge. Instead of distancing himself, he was seen at Epstein's properties, on flights with him, and at social events where young women were present under highly questionable circumstances. When people learned how deep the relationship went, the public was horrified, and the palace found itself in a position where it had to respond. How could the royal family justify keeping Andrew in any official role when he had chosen to maintain contact with a man whose crimes involved vulnerable young women? It was not just that he knew Epstein, but the fact that he appeared to shrug off the consequences of that friendship. And that gave the impression that he either didn't understand the severity of Epstein's actions or simply didn't care about how it made him look. The longer he kept that association going, the more it eroded trust in him and in the monarchy itself. And this was the first crack in his public reputation that never healed. The second huge blow came when Andrew agreed to settle a civil lawsuit brought by Virginia Giuffre in 2022. And though he did not admit wrongdoing, the size of the settlement was staggering. He agreed to pay a multi-million-pound figure, far beyond what most ordinary people could imagine, and millions of members of the public reacted as though the payment itself was an admission of guilt. Giuffre had accused Andrew of sexually abusing her when she was a teenager, and while he denied all the allegations, many people saw the settlement as proof that he had something to hide. The fact that he chose to settle rather than fight the claims made it seem as though the truth would have been worse if it came out in public, and this destroyed whatever slim credibility he had left. Ordinary people struggling with world costs at the same time saw the contrast between his vast payout and their daily struggles, and felt that this was yet another example of how royalty gets privileges that others never could. However, his effort to clear the air through a televised interview proved to be one of the worst decisions he ever made, because it did not calm the public, but instead made things far worse. In that interview, he tried to explain his side of the story, but he came across as tone-deaf and out of touch. He offered explanations that seemed unbelievable to most viewers, and he spoke about his actions without showing real empathy for the suffering of Epstein's victims. Instead of expressing regret or understanding, he focused on defending his reputation as though misunderstanding him was the real problem. This made it look as though he placed his own image above the pain of those who had been hurt, and the public reaction was immediate and unforgiving. After that interview, the palace situation changed almost overnight because it became impossible for senior royals to pretend nothing had happened. He was forced to step back from all official duties indefinitely, and what had once been a position of honor became a position of shame. People who had admired him as a war veteran and senior royal began to see him as a figure of embarrassment, and that change in public sentiment mattered more than anything to the institution he once represented. But Andrew's controversies did not stop there, because over the years he had also surrounded himself with other questionable figures and made decisions that drew criticism. At various points in his career, he had social and business ties with people whose reputations were far from clean, and these associations raised questions about his judgment. Some of these individuals were suspected of shady activities, and although none of these ties were criminal on their own, they added to a sense that Andrew did not always choose his company wisely. When the public sees someone linked to one scandal after another, even if each issue on its own might be explainable, the overall picture becomes one of poor judgment and reckless behavior. Another controversy that followed Andrew was his role as a trade envoy, because he was criticized for using public funds for travel and for engaging with controversial figures on behalf of British interests. While his job was to promote trade and build economic relationships, critics said he often ended up with awkward alliances that did little for the country's reputation. This reinforced the idea that he was out of his depth in international affairs, and that when given authority, he could turn it into a public relations weakness rather than a strength. Beyond the scandals involving other people, there were also complaints from those who worked for him personally, because former staff and aides described times when he was rude or out of line with acceptable behavior toward those on his payroll. While some people might see these grievances as small compared to international controversies, the fact that they came from inside his own household and inner circles added to the narrative that he was someone difficult to work with and often inconsiderate of others. And when you combine personal complaints with massive public scandals, the whole picture begins to look very bad. As if these controversies were not enough, the very public dispute over his eviction from his sprawling estate became another focal point of outrage, because it made him look entitled and unwilling to accept the consequences of his actions. He insisted that he had every right to stay in an enormous mansion for which he paid a nominal rent, and he argued that he had spent his own money renovating the property. But in the eyes of most ordinary people struggling with rising housing costs and shrinking opportunities, this only made him look out of touch. Why should someone who had been forced out of public life continue to enjoy luxury while people everywhere were tightening their belts? Even after the major scandals, new details continued to emerge that reminded the public of just how serious the issues surrounding him were. At various times, allegations and documents suggested he may have remained in contact with powerful figures linked to wrongdoing. And even though not every claim was proven in court, the ongoing nature of these revelations kept the controversies alive. When a scandal keeps resurfacing in new forms, it becomes harder and harder for a public figure to shake it off, because each new detail becomes another reason for public distrust. As Andrew's situation worsened, political pressure grew stronger, and this was something the monarchy had never fully encountered before. Elected officials began speaking openly about the possibility of stripping him of his title through legislation, because they argued that a city or nation should not be represented by someone accused of such serious misconduct. This was an extraordinary development, because it meant that Andrew's troubles were no longer just a matter for the royal household, but had spilled over into national governance. When politicians are ready to challenge the traditional protections around royalty, it shows just how much public confidence has collapsed. There were even questions about whether law enforcement might revisit other matters linked to him, and although no new charges were brought, the fact that his name continued to appear in legal scrutiny kept the controversies alive and kept him from moving forward with his life. His reputation became so toxic that private companies and respected organizations would not touch him with a 10-foot pole, because no one wanted to associate their brand or work with someone so deeply mired in scandal. Attempts to find private work failed repeatedly, because even when money was offered, the reputational risk was too great. But here's the most interesting part of all this: Princess Anne's cold refusal. As Andrew's troubles piled up, the pressure from politicians grew, and this was something the monarchy had never really faced before. Elected officials began openly talking about the idea of taking away his title, because they argued that no city or nation should be represented by someone accused of such serious misconduct. This was a huge shift, because it meant Andrew's problems were no longer just a private family matter, and they had spilled into national politics. When politicians were ready to challenge the traditional protections around royals, it showed just how much public trust had collapsed. Even though no new charges were brought, Andrew's name kept surfacing in legal scrutiny, and that kept the controversies alive while preventing him from moving forward. His reputation had become so toxic that no respected company or organization wanted to be associated with him, and attempts to find private work kept failing because the risk was too great. But the most interesting part of all this came when Andrew turned to the one person he might have counted on: his sister, Princess Anne. Anne has spent her life performing hundreds of royal duties each year without complaint, and she represents charities, attends ceremonies, and works tirelessly for causes she believes in. She has become one of the most trusted voices in the monarchy, and her reputation is the opposite of her brother's because she has never been at the center of a scandal. People close to the palace say Anne had grown completely fed up with Andrew's constant drama, and she believed the monarchy survives through hard work and dedication, not special treatment or entitled behavior. When Andrew approached her, asking for support to reclaim his position, Anne made it very clear that he had run out of chances, and there would be no comeback. She told him his actions had permanent consequences, and showed no sympathy for his situation. Her frustration wasn't just about his recent scandals, because she had watched him squander opportunities and embarrass the family for decades while she spent her life in service. Andrew seemed to believe his royal status gave him privileges without responsibilities, and that difference in attitude had already created a rift between them long before his misconduct became public. One of the most striking things in this story is how Anne's work ethic collided with Andrew's sense of entitlement. She believes being a royal is a job of service, and she reminded him that since he failed at that, he had no right to the title or privileges. She reportedly listed all the ways he had damaged the family's reputation, from his lavish lifestyle to his poor judgment in choosing friends, and she made it clear she would not help him repair the damage. Anne also supports a smaller, more focused monarchy because she believes it makes sense financially and politically, and she saw Andrew's removal as necessary to protect the institution. For Anne, keeping Andrew out was not about spite, but about protecting the monarchy she has devoted her life to. She reportedly told other family members that his comeback would harm the crown's future more than it would help family harmony, and she prioritized the institution over personal feelings. Her loyalty is to the crown, and she believes public trust and respect must come first. There is a certain irony in this, because Anne does all the work while Andrew sits higher in the line of succession simply because he is male. She never publicly complained about that, and her refusal to help him shows that earning respect through duty is far more important than titles or birthright. By standing firm, Anne crushed Andrew's last hope of returning to royal life, and she sent a clear message that privilege cannot shield anyone from accountability. The monarchy is changing, and there is no room for those unwilling to meet the standards of service and responsibility that Anne has always embodied. Even as Anne stood firm, questions remained about what this meant for the future of the family and the monarchy, and whether keeping Andrew out forever was the only way to protect the institution. These questions set the stage for the next chapter, where we explore how the monarchy continues to evolve under scandals, challenges, and modern scrutiny. So, what are your thoughts on this? Do you think Andrew could ever redeem himself in the eyes of the public? Or has his string of scandals made a royal comeback impossible? Let us know in the comments section below. If you enjoyed watching this video, make sure to like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more. Also, click the next video shown on your screen. You will enjoy it.